Could you kind of explain to us where we are now and what this means for our quality of life in Talbot County?
Yeah, happy to do so. So council dealt with on Tuesday a series of what we could call collectively Lakeside resolutions, and two of them passed. Two of those resolutions, Resolution 347 and 348. And these two particular resolutions were drafted to respond to the MDE, Maryland Department of the Environment, who wrote to us, to the council, to Talbot County a year ago and said, here are some unresolved questions that we have with the Lakeside development. One of which is can you give us phase by phase all of the sewer allocations? The term is the EDUs, the equivalent dwelling unit. One house is one equivalent dwelling unit. But when you get to a restaurant or a retail store or an office, they get measured differently, but they get measured in units equivalent to a house, an equivalent dwelling unit. So give us those, MDE asked, give us those EDUs for every phase of Lakeside, 5 phases as it was specified earlier. And on top of that, back in 2020, when the previous council approved Lakeside, in mapping out the areas that were authorized for immediate eligibility for water and sewer connection and those that would be sometime down the road, there were errors made in the maps. And the errors that were specifically identified were outside of Lakeside. They weren't subject to the legislation at all, and yet somehow they changed. Well, MDE asked, would you please fix those? There, of course, also was, as we discovered going along, this sort of unresolved question about, did that 2020 action by the previous council actually change the lower 2/5 of Lakeside? Did it actually remap and redesignate it as eligible for sewer connection in 3 to 5 years? Or did it leave it unchanged? And what we discovered was the unchanged status was unprogrammed for any future water and sewer connection, which would be a funny designation for a development inside of an annexed area. But nevertheless, the legislation was not explicit in doing so, and so that question hung out there. Now that those two pieces of legislation passed, one to provide those EDUs for all phases, the other to fix the maps, we're not actually at the end of the process. The state still has to act on this. MDE, Maryland Department of the Environment, still needs to approve. They have the final voice. And in fact, they don't simply get an up or down vote on what we passed. They can accept, they can reject, or they can alter what we send up to them. It comes down to the state. Now, how often do they do that to a local jurisdiction? How often do they go off in their own direction?
Yeah.
That seems to me like an unlikely outcome. If these are, at least on the surface, ostensibly responsive to their questions, it seems to me they're likely to accept them, even though the phases that we provided are not actual sequential chronological phases as most people would understand the meaning of the word phase. They're actually the neighborhoods, which may or may not be built in that order. Nevertheless, they're called phases in the legislation, and therefore they're arguably responsive to MDE. And so I doubt MDE is going to choose to argue with this. This is a chronically understaffed agency. They're not looking to put a lot of their own effort into this. They're not looking to pick a fight with anybody. They want to resolve this. Yeah. And so my guess, looking in my imperfect crystal ball, is that they will accept these. If that happens, what are the practical effects of this? Now, remember that these two resolutions that council just passed were not the only recent pieces of legislation on Lakeside. We also passed recently Resolution 338, which said that at each of those phases, or actually not those phases, but at least at each time the Lakeside wastewater treatment plant is going to be built in a modular fashion. The one that they're about to put online now treats 100,000 gallons. Well, you can't build a giant wastewater treatment plant and just give it a trickle of, it has to be sized. It needs a certain amount of flow. And it will soon have enough of that flow. It'll soon be licensed and it will begin operating. But when it reaches its capacity, then the developer of Lakeside can add a second 100,000 gallon modular unit. And it's designed to be that way so that they don't need to invest the full cost of the plant up front should the development stall or something like that. They're not out all that money for all that time. And two, mechanically, biologically, it will work. It will have sufficient flow for each of these modules. But what 338 did was to say that at each of those 100,000 gallon phases, the county will get, well, MDE needs to review that. That constitutes a major modification of the permit, and Talbot County will also get a weigh-in at that point, a check-in, if you will.
With 338 in place, do you feel like we have this opportunity to maybe look at the scope of the project every time we look at this approval process?
That certainly was the council's intent and hope in passing this, that these will be meaningful check-ins. Each time they need that next 100,000 gallon increment, the question goes back to the Planning Commission, and the Planning Commission must make a finding of consistency. And the finding of consistency is based in state law on the 7 relevant standards. Is the timing of the development appropriate? Is it right? And that can mean for county facilities, for infrastructure, for all of those pieces that we consider when we look at new development. So there is at least that opportunity. Some would argue that really this is pro forma, that we will have no choice but to approve it at that point. We'll let the lawyers argue that out when the time comes. But what we spelled out was that a finding of consistency must be made, and we know that there are certain standards that must be met in order for the County Planning Commission to make that finding of consistency.
You know, I noticed that you and Lynn Milkey were in the minority on both these resolutions. Could you tell me why you had concerns?
Well, keep in mind that we had other legislation on the table in the same meeting. I had introduced resolution number 353.
Right.
That 353 would have done many of the same things, but also would have, it had some slightly different language, and it would have, rather than signing off on the eligibility of the lower part of Lakeside for sewer connection anticipated within 3 to 5 years, nobody anticipates that this is going to be ready for that kind of build out in 3 to 5 years, but rather step it down for eligible for a connection in 5 to 10 years. Well, the developer's been telling us that this could be an even longer build up than that. So that legislation, which contained the EDUs, the mapping corrections, and also this explicit redesignation, reclassification of that lower 2/5 of Lakeside, as the code was W3S3. eligible for water and sewer connection in 5 to 10 years. That was what we had put on the table, and I was holding out for that as the better solution to this. And so both Lynn and I voted against the resolutions that were on the table, which kind of acknowledged the mapping of eligible in 3 to 5 years, but didn't explicitly make that change.
I see.
Didn't explicitly remap and redesignate, which was, as I see it, an oversight of the 2020 legislation that originally approved Lakeside.
Are we, use the old phrase, are we better off now after we've gone through this significant community review process? I know that Talbot Integrity Project, Dan Watson's group, feels this was a defeat in many ways in protecting the environment.
Well, this certainly is nothing like what they were advocating. And so in that sense, did this reverse Lakeside? Did it reset Lakeside? Did it completely take us back to look at the fundamental questions behind this development? No. It fundamentally, what this did is it affirmed the previous council's decision of 2020 and added some clarifications or corrected some errors that were made at that time. But substantially what it does is it affirms that earlier action.
And so when you look at this experience yourself, that you were heavily involved, what have we learned? I mean, could there be another Lakeside down the road?
Well, I think one of the things that we learned is that elections matter, and that this decision makers who are looking at these proposals bring certain biases and values to those decisions, and we had a much more development friendly council than we did with earlier councils when this decision was made in 2020.
Yeah,
that pendulum will swing back and forth over time. We have learned that understanding the details really matters. I think that we look back at I look back at the decision made by council in 2020 and realize that yes, that it is true that I opposed it, but I didn't know all the reasons why I should have opposed it at the time. I had an impressionistic view of what was going on, but not a detailed view of what all of the language meant.
yeah.
Of the phasing and such of Lakeside. We didn't understand what the maps meant, and I think some of us felt misled by the interpretation of the maps in the comprehensive water and sewer plan. Certainly, the experience of the continuity of staff who have been around for a long time and have watched this work through the process, and also frankly council members. We've learned, and this is not news, that the county council has complete jurisdiction over water and sewer connections in the unincorporated areas of the council. We play a lesser role, not a invisible role, but a lesser role for when it comes to new annexation to towns, to our municipalities. Yep. And so one of the critical pieces is the continued communication between county and municipalities, and that's something that I think that we're working hard at, that we want to further strengthen, that we want, as the county will be going through its new comprehensive planning, to make sure that we are agreeing with the municipalities about what those growth boundaries should look like, about what that pace of development should look like, and hopefully we've got a good basis for doing that going forward.
Yeah. Well, Pete Lesher, thank you so much for your time. Is there anything else that you want to make sure that people know about
I
this?
guess perhaps one parting thought is that look, the Lakeside question has been enormously consuming for the focus of both council and staff. And there are lots of other issues with urgency that we need to go out and address. And so I look forward to being able to turn our attention to some of those other matters, only one of which is working with the town of Trappe to look for a solution to replace their old technology wastewater treatment plant for the part that serves the rest of Trappe that is not the Lakeside development.
No. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Please have a
Okay.
good weekend.
Thank you, you too.